addition to the Hermitage, and then incredibly sold off many of its treasures. Lenin, the architect of the Russian Revolution, who took art from the mansions of the rich to give to the masses. And St. Petersburg itself, which during its infamous 900-day Nazi siege saw 1 million people die. But through tragedy and rebirth, the Hermitage has endured. Like the Louvre in Paris, it remains one of the great museums of the world.
This extraordinary place is an art museum, one of the greatest in the world. It's also been a good many other things. It was the palace of the Russian Tsars, a seat of absolute imperial authority. It's been the scene of exotic love affairs. One ruler was murdered here. Great ideas were conceived in these opulent chambers. This also served as a gilded blinder to those imperial autocrats, and there was more than one of them, who didn't want to know about the reality of Russia and its long-suffering people. But above everything else, the Hermitage is, represents, and remembers. It is a repository of art. The Hermitage collection was accumulated over more than 2 centuries by one Tsarina, 6 Tsars, and the communist commissars who came after them. The palace, which houses the collection, is itself a work of art. Its 1,000 rooms express the taste of 2 centuries. From replications of ancient Roman mosaics to the Baroque complexities of the 18th century. The extensions to the Winter Palace were called Hermitages. The name now refers to all 5 buildings of the Hermitage, including the Winter Palace. It was built in the 1750s by Francesco Rastrelli to be the winter residence of the Tsars. He's credited with inventing the architectural style known as Russian Baroque. Rooted in 18th century Western European design, Rastrelli's creation incorporates bright colors from the houses of northern Russia and the unique ornamentation of Orthodox churches. The Hermitage is thus inseparable from the great city around it, named St. Petersburg at its birth, Petrograd during World War I, and then Leningrad after the death of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1924. And finally, following the collapse of Soviet communism, the city returned to its original name, St. Petersburg. It is not an old city like London or Paris. It's not even as old as Boston. But it is a sublime expression of 18th century architecture. It was built by Peter the Great as his capital. St. Petersburg became a proclamation of Russia's might and potential importance in the world. The Winter Palace was begun in 1754, 29 years after the death of Peter the Great by his daughter Elizabeth. It was larger than the Louvre and the Tuileries put together, and was designed to be St. Petersburg's crowning masterpiece, the official home of the Tsars, a function it fulfilled for 260 years. In 1762, when Catherine the Great assumed power, it was here in the Winter Palace. For the next 34 years, she presided over one of the more glorious and turbulent epochs of Russian history. It was Catherine who dramatically expanded the imperial art collection that grew into the great Hermitage Museum. She knew that to amass great art was not only a demonstration of taste, but of power. Like Peter the Great, she was a visionary, and like Peter, she turned to the West for ideas and culture. Catherine was not Russian. She was German by birth, the daughter of a minor princeling. In 1745, at the age of 15, she married the heir to the Russian throne. Young Peter III seems to have been a neurotic dullard. He was more interested in his collection of toy soldiers than in his new young wife. The lonely and treacherous life of the Russian court toughened Catherine. Reading was her sanctuary. She subscribed to the gossipy private newsletter of European philosophy and the arts, the Correspondance littéraire, edited by Baron Melchior von Grimm. Like Catherine, Grimm was a German whose culture was French. They began writing to each other. During her lifetime, Catherine composed more than 1,500 letters to this erudite man. Catherine wrote elegantly in French, badly in Russian. She was a veritable fountain of words and ideas, writing everything from serious political philosophy and history to light entertainments. In 1762, Catherine's husband became Tsar Peter III. Their marriage of 18 years had ceased to exist, except as a formality. Immediately, Peter alienated everybody around him. He practiced Lutheranism in defiance of the orthodoxy that was his country's state religion. He insisted on speaking German, rather than the preferred language of the Russian aristocracy, which was French. Catherine, on the other hand, was fluent in French and made every effort to perfect her Russian. She had abandoned Lutheranism to embrace the Russian Orthodox Church. She had become enthralled with Russia and adored the country passionately for the rest of her life. Catherine had developed powerful friendships in the imperial court and the military. Intimately aware of her husband's weaknesses and eccentricities, she'd spent years preparing her own ascent to the throne. Then, in June 1762, it all came to a head. The growing discontent finally persuaded the aristocratic Orloff brothers to take action. They staged a palace coup. Peter was deposed, and murdered a few days later. The royal court announced, officially and with a straight face, that the Tsar had died of colic. Catherine was quickly crowned Tsarina, or Empress, in an elaborate ceremony staged in Moscow. Most Russians were delighted to be rid of Peter and to have their bright, elegant new ruler. The Tsarina returned to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where she was received with pomp and awe. The reign of Catherine the Great had begun. To the imperial throne, she brought an autocrat's will tempered by a liberal intellect. She knew a great deal about Western European art and literature, and she'd already conceived of a way of using art to elevate Russia's prestige and influence. She didn't try to impress the courts of Europe by collecting a few masterpieces. She collected masterpieces by the carload. Rubens, Reynolds, Watteau, Carracci, Rembrandt. I am not a lover of art, Catherine said of her own collecting. It is voracity. I'm a glutton. She tended to buy other people's tastes with entire collections of pictures. Franz Hals' Young Man with a Glove was one of 200 masterpieces bought from the merchant Gotskowski. The Gotskowski purchase was also a personal and political coup for the new Tsarina. The pictures had been collected for King Frederick of Prussia, the idol of Catherine's late husband, Peter III. But Frederick had gotten himself involved in Europe's 7 Years' War and was broke. Catherine the Great wasn't. The collection also included Van Bobberen's Concert. She was a fiercely competitive art buyer who enjoyed the acquisition game against other collectors for its own sake. When a collection of 198 masterworks became available in England, Catherine snatched it up. It included 15 Van Dycks, among them his double portrait of Philadelphia and Elizabeth Wharton. Lorraine's Gulf of Bailly. Jordain's own family portrait. Murillo's Assumption of the Virgin. And Rembrandt's monumental Abraham's Sacrifice of Isaac. They'd been collected by Sir Robert Walpole, the former Prime Minister of Britain. The pictures also included the cream of English painting. Eworth's portrait of Edward VI, painted about 1550. John Wooton's Hounds and a Magpie. And Godfrey Knoller's portrait of the woodcarver Grindling Gibbons. Samuel Johnson, one of the great literary figures of the day, denounced the Walpole sale. The controversy spilled over into the House of Commons, where members were incensed that a chapter in the history of British art would be shipped off to barbaric Russia. Catherine wrote her agent,
"You see how the birds fly into my snare of their own accord? Your humble servant has got her claws on them and will no more let them go than a cat would a mouse."
Another of Catherine's early acquisitions was Jesus Healing the Blind Bartimaeus by the great Dutch colorist Lucas van Leyden. Catherine's critics insisted that she didn't love her art, but just collected it for display and competition. If Catherine wasn't an art lover, what was it all about, this gluttony for the beautiful? In fact, she demonstrated a deep affection for her paintings. She used to wander through the hallways and vast state chambers at night, looking at her treasures. To the sculptor Falconet, she wrote,
"Only the mice and I can admire all this." My pictures are beautiful. When would you like to come and see them?
Catherine spent the brief northern summers at Tsarskoe Selo, a country palace just outside of St. Petersburg. But she was most at home in her great winter palace, surrounded by her growing art collection.
I moved to my little winter shack, walked up the marble staircase, and passed through room after room to walk amid quantities of things that I love and delight in. My little retreat is so situated that to go back and forth from my room takes 3,000 steps. And it is these winter walks that keep me in good health and on my feet. Then returning to my room after having walked around the whole palace, about 2 miles.
Catherine was not an especially religious woman, but owned hundreds of pictures that, in previous centuries, had been produced through the patronage of the Roman Catholic Church. When offered several of Raphael's religious works, Catherine felt she'd had more than enough.
If the subject matter is too sad or solemn, I'm not interested.
Much of her collection, like Chardin's Washerwoman, was completely secular. A game of backgammon by Jan Steen. Snyder's Village Fruit Stall. Lancret's appreciation of a ballerina in Camargo dancing. And Peter Paul Rubens' portrayal of the eternal lovers, Venus and Adonis. The Winter Palace walls were becoming crowded with paintings, its halls cluttered with tapestries and sculpture. In 1763, Catherine had a winter garden built on the main level of the Winter Palace. It was enclosed, it was filled with exotic plants, birds, and monkeys. The tropics had been brought to the frozen north. The Tsarina had 2 pavilions put up on either side of the garden, and there she gave dinner parties and hung pictures. This was the beginning of the addition to the Winter Palace that Catherine the Great called her Hermitage. The word Hermitage means, of course, the dwelling place of a hermit, usually a holy man. Although the gossips of history have exaggerated Catherine's romantic life, she did have a long succession of lovers, and she was decidedly not a puritanical lady. In naming the great extension of the Winter Palace, she was simply following the fashion of her day. Many great estates in 18th century Europe had elegant little hermitages used for informal entertaining, reading, and gossiping. Servants were excluded, so that the royal guests need not fear that their antics would be reported to their critics. Catherine, her friends, and her court lived it up in her outsized hermitage, but there were rules governing their behavior, composed by the Empress herself.
Leave all rank outside, along with hats and swords. High spirits are fine, but don't damage or break anything. Speak quietly. Don't shout and give others nearby a headache. Don't sigh, don't yawn, and don't burden or bore anyone. Eat to your heart's content, but drink with moderation so that you are able to find your legs and leave by the door. Mind your own business, and don't wash your dirty linen in public.
Catherine surrounded herself with splendor, a symbol of her imperial power as much as personal self-indulgence. She wore and used exquisite objects, which are now part of the Hermitage collection. This brooch, a veritable spray of rubies, emeralds, and diamonds. The water in which she washed her hands was brought to her in this golden pitcher. The serious work of Catherine's life was intertwined with this almost overpowering elegance. Her motto, usefulness, was emblazoned in jewels on her snuff box. For court and ceremonial occasions, she wore this jeweled sword. And this chalice was used in many coronations, including hers. (1764), which marks the beginning of the Hermitage, was an interesting year elsewhere in the world. In the American colonies, Brown University was founded at Providence, Rhode Island. In London, Samuel Johnson and Edward Gibbon formed the Literary Society, while at Salzburg, Austria, an 8-year-old boy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, wrote his first symphony, and Franz Joseph Haydn of Vienna composed his 22nd, called The Philosopher. In France, Voltaire had already established his reputation as the father of the Enlightenment. In this age of great awakenings, Catherine the Great tried to import Western ideas to civilize her beloved country. Catherine had a great affinity for her grandfather-in-law, Peter the Great. Both were visionaries. Peter had wanted to modernize Russia, with great infusions of Western technology, economic theory, and social custom. Catherine thought that the critical imports were ideas, whole atmospheres of philosophy and aesthetics which could, she believed, awaken Russia to the contemporary world. Catherine adroitly linked her reign to Peter the Great's by ordering an immense monument. The foundation was a 1,500-ton piece of granite from Finland. 500 men were needed to haul it ashore. In this most public statement of admiration, Catherine the Great aligned herself forever with Russia's greatest Tsar. Peter the Great lived, ruled, and died long before the Hermitage existed. Art was not a major interest, but he recognized its importance as part of the European culture he was bringing to Russia. Not a man of refined taste, the Tsar's instruction to his agents was simple: don't buy bad pictures. So, they bought him, among other things, a Rembrandt, David's Farewell to Jonathan, which is now part of the Hermitage's permanent collection. Peter acquired more than 200 paintings from dealers in Brussels and London. Most of them were Dutch and Flemish and radiated a naturalness similar in style to Van Honthorst's Christ in the Carpenter's Shop. This comfortable realism was in sharp contrast to the religious art of Russia, whose traditional form was the icon, orthodox images, beautiful and enigmatic. The great age of icons began in the 12th century. In paintings done on wood panels, the Russians portrayed themselves as smoke-eyed saints and mystics. St. John the Theologian in silence. The life of Nicholas, patron saint of Russia. Mary, mother of Jesus. These figures symbolize a capacity for sorrow and suffering. They tell of a spiritual life beyond the comprehension of Western Europeans. They speak from the profound depths of the Russian soul. But Peter the Great wasn't interested in the mysticism of the Russian soul. Western European painting of earthly reality echoed his vibrant 18th century outlook, in which people, not saints, dominated the considerations of the state. This portrait of Peter the Great as a young man hangs in the Hermitage. He was determined to import much that he had encountered in his Western European travels. He created a great navy that he modeled after those he'd seen in Holland and England. And he forced men to shorten their coats and cut their beards to conform to European fashion, an order so strongly resisted that Peter finally allowed men to keep their beards if they wore a medal showing they'd paid a heavy tax. But Peter's drive to modernize went far beyond fashion. In the early 1700s, he decided to build a whole new capital city. A century later, the great epic poem, The Bronze Horseman, by Alexander Pushkin, recreated Peter's vision of what St. Petersburg would be. On a shore washed by desolate waves he stood, and he thought, from here we will outface the Swede. Despite our haughty neighbor, I shall found a city here. By nature, we are fated to cut a window through to Europe, to stand with a firm foothold on the sea. The haughty neighbor was King Charles XII of Sweden, a young man with an almost maniacal love of war. The Swedish Empire encircled the Baltic Sea, and Charles XII was determined to annex Russia. But Peter the Great faced the Swedish threat and put his firm foothold on the sea. The first structure at St. Petersburg, the fortress of Peter and Paul. While the massive and bloody Russo-Swedish War raged on, Peter threw himself into the building of a whole new city on the islands and swamps of the Neva estuary. A graceful shape began to emerge from the chaos of construction on the banks of the Neva. St. Petersburg was becoming a city of canals built on scores of marshy islands. It is a city of inordinate beauty. It's often called the Venice of the North. But it was created at an appalling cost by the savage, brilliant visionary who ordered it built as you and I would order lunch. By Peter's own estimate, 100,000 serfs and indentured craftsmen died in forced labor constructing St. Petersburg. The Tsar was everywhere, planning, supervising, demanding, exhorting. He issued an edict forbidding any building by stone anywhere in Russia except St. Petersburg, forcing every mason to come north and work on the city. Artists and artisans from all over Europe embellished new buildings with elegant decor, much of it surviving to our own time. Aristocrats were pressured into putting up great mansions and palaces in St. Petersburg. Libraries and universities opened, and great cathedrals rose into the Russian sky. By 1712, Peter was winning the war with Sweden, and so confidently moved his imperial government from Moscow to St. Petersburg. It remained the capital of Russia for more than 200 years. The Tsar's summer palace along the Neva, a cottage in the Dutch style, epitomized his taste for things Western. He regarded St. Petersburg itself as his window on the West, an aperture through which European ideas could flow. He knew that a window alone couldn't change anything as frozen in custom and ignorance as Russia. When Peter wasn't putting down rebellions, fighting wars against the Swedes and the Turks, or building cities, he addressed himself to the problem of trying to haul his country into the modern world of the 18th century. Of this accomplishment, he said, "We have lifted the curtain drawn in front of our country's curiosity, which deprived it of communication with the whole world." The man who did this bust of Peter the Great was an Italian sculptor named Carlo Rastrelli, whose son Francesco designed the Winter Palace for Peter's successor, his daughter Elizabeth. Peter the Great did not live to see the construction of this splendid home of the Tsars, or the Hermitage which was added to it. But he did live long enough to see a Baroque metropolis rise on the banks of the Neva. Peter the Great died in his city in 1725. He was 53 years old. At the end, he said, I hope God will forgive my many sins because of the good I have tried to do for my people. By 1782, the Winter Palace had been the home of Catherine the Great for 20 years. The Hermitage, added on a dozen years before, was bursting at the seams with art. 2 more Hermitage buildings were about to be constructed. Catherine the Great was halfway through her long reign. Peter the Great had died 57 years before. On her tribute to him, the statue of a great bronze horseman, she had a motto carved in both Russian and Latin: Peter first, Catherine second. She had kept Peter's window on the west open, and through it flowed the great art of Europe. These were her monuments. Her Rembrandts. Rubens. Her Lottos. Beyond images, Catherine also collected ideas. 32,000 volumes of them, making the library an integral part of the Hermitage. Catherine's collecting was also what we would call today a political statement. She was trying to associate herself and her country with the Enlightenment, the most important intellectual movement to sweep Europe since the Reformation. It believed in the infinite possibilities of science and human reason. The Enlightenment put its faith in progress and the perfectibility of all things. Its prophets and spokesmen were the so-called philosophes of France. The novelist and philosopher of the Enlightenment, François-Marie Arouet, known to history as Voltaire, had become the intellectual superstar of Europe. He was a somewhat contradictory man, assaulting monarchies with witty contempt while allowing himself to be courted by kings, emperors, and the Tsarina of Russia. Catherine the Great's correspondence with Voltaire, affectionate, bantering, frequently profound, lasted for the rest of his life. She formed a friendship with another of France's so-called philosophes, Denis Diderot. He was a celebrated playwright and encyclopedist, and he became one of Catherine's important advisors on the acquisition of art. Titian's Danae was among 600 paintings Diderot got in 1772 from the private collection of the treasurer of France, Pierre Crozat. It was Catherine's greatest coup. It also included Rembrandt's Holy Family. The Crozat pictures were regarded as one of the finest of all French collections. The purchase caused an outbreak of indignation in France. Diderot wrote to a friend in St. Petersburg, "I am the object of absolute, genuine public hatred because I'm sending you paintings. The collectors, the artists, and the rich are all up in arms. I'm taking absolutely no notice." The 600 Crozat paintings traveled from France to St. Petersburg by ship. These great masterworks, among them Van Dyck's self-portrait, enormously enhanced the reputation of Catherine's collection. Another important edition that Diderot bought directly from the artist is Le Paralytique by Jean-Baptiste Greuze. Diderot praised it as an outstanding example of moral painting. The phrase means art which elevates the drama of ordinary life to the status of heroic tragedy. Here, a paralyzed old man is secure in the care and love of his family, his reward for dedicating himself to their well-being. While Catherine the Great was engaged in art collecting and intellectual correspondence with the philosophes of France, she was still a working empress. She replied to one of her art advisors who complained that she was not paying enough attention to her collecting.
To deal properly with the fine arts, one must have fewer interruptions than we have had in the last 6 weeks.
The interruptions included war with Turkey and the annexation of parts of Poland. British cartoonists saw a gluttonous Catherine devouring one country after another. In 1774, fresh from her imperial successes, Catherine invited Diderot to St. Petersburg. Every afternoon, the Tsarina received the French philosopher in her study for what she called a little hour. Diderot tended to lecture her. He was a man of erupting enthusiasms who often made his points by jabbing his listeners with his forefinger. A startled Catherine wrote to a friend in Paris,
Your Diderot is a very extraordinary man. I cannot get out of my conversations with him without having my thighs bruised and black and blue. I have been obliged to put a table between him and me to shelter myself and my limbs from his gesticulation.
But he went too far when he referred to Russian serfs as slaves.
There are no slaves in Russia, only peasants attached to the land. I know of no country where the worker loves his land and his home more than in Russia.
There seems to have been a pattern in the reigns of several great Russian autocrats. They began as liberal reformers, they end as bitter reactionaries. Catherine the Great's 34 years on the throne of Russia were a classic playout of that pattern. She composed a document which she called her nakaz, or Great Instruction. It's Catherine's vision of the ideal Russian state, humane, probably rid of the curse of serfdom, but still run by an autocrat. She thought that the country was too vast and diverse to be controlled by any less absolute form of government. The Russian landscape appears tranquil in these sketches commissioned by Catherine, but idyllic pastoral scenes belied the squalid reality of most Russian lives. 1/3 of all the people were serfs, peasants who were the property of landholders, industrial entrepreneurs, or the government. Serf owners paid the bulk of Russia's taxes, pressuring their human possessions to work harder as compensation. The aristocracy paid no taxes at all. In 1773, a Don Cossack named Emelian Pugachev led a massive uprising of Turks, Tatars, and Cossacks. For 2 years, estates were pillaged and aristocrats were murdered before Catherine's army finally crushed the revolt. The first mass popular rebellion in Russian history was over. In the midst of all these alarms and crises, Denis Diderot went right on lecturing Catherine, preaching liberalism and enlightenment. She found him increasingly irrelevant.
You work only on paper, which accepts anything, is smooth, flexible, and offers no obstacles either to your imagination or to your pen. While I, poor Empress, work on human skin, which is far more sensitive and touchy.
When Diderot's fellow philosopher, Voltaire, was advanced in years and in declining health, he wrote to Catherine, hoping for an invitation to visit St. Petersburg. Catherine had learned, perhaps, that friendships with French philosophers are best conducted from afar. She was an adroit politician who knew how to say no with great charm.
I know you are in delicate health. I admire your courage, but I should be inconsolable if you were to suffer from the effort. Neither myself nor Europe would forgive me.
She was, however, genuinely saddened by Voltaire's death in 1778.
He is my master. It was he, or rather his writings, who formed my mind. If possible, buy his library and his papers, including his letters.
Voltaire's library was packed up and shipped to the Hermitage, along with 100 copies of his complete works, which Catherine had ordered.
I want them to be studied and learned by heart. They will form citizens, geniuses, heroes, and authors, and will foster 1,000 talents.
The 18th century was slipping away. Catherine and her closest counselors, many of them former lovers who'd remained her friends and colleagues, fought wars against the Ottoman Empire, annexed parts of Poland and the Crimea, improved education and local government, and above all, they made Russia a major diplomatic player in Europe. Catherine was painted in vigorous middle age. About the same time, a French visitor wrote of the strong impression the Empress made at the height of her powers. I've said that she was short, yet on days when she appeared in state, everything about her, head held high, the eagle eyes, the assured bearing that comes with the habit of command, was so majestic that she seemed to rule the world. In between the grand receptions for visiting ambassadors and the increasing demands of matters of state, Catherine still took time to work on her collection of art. In 1779, her principal art advisor, Baron Melchior von Grimm, learned that yet another collection, belonging to a French Count Baudouin, was for sale. It consisted of 19 pictures. 8 of them were Rembrandts. It took von Grimm 5 years to persuade Catherine to buy them. She finally gave in with an impish flash of imperial wit.
The world is a strange place, and the number of happy people is very small. I can see that Monsieur le Comte Baudouin is not going to be happy until he sells his collection. And it appears that I am destined to make him happy.
Accumulated over 30 years, Catherine the Great's collection of pictures, which were the basis of the Hermitage, surpassed what the Louvre in Paris had collected over 4 centuries. By the mid-1780s, Catherine had become bored with art collecting. Drama became her new passion. She had this exquisite little theater built at the far end of the Hermitage. The decor was in the high neoclassical style. The seating was limited. The stage was designed to accommodate operas as well as plays. Catherine had always loved the theater. She wrote plays and the libretti for 5 operas, all featuring prominent figures from Russian history. The years were closing on her. Catherine was moving into old age, preparing to become a magnificent memory. In 1788, she composed an epitaph for herself.
When she ascended to the throne of Russia, she wished to do good and tried to bring happiness, freedom, and prosperity to her subjects. She forgave easily and hated no one. She was good-natured and easygoing. She had a cheerful temperament, Republican sentiments, and a kind heart. She had friends. Work was easy for her. She loved sociability and the arts.
This little theater seems to have been her life's last escape. Russia and the world were too much with her. As she wrote and watched plays here, the old monarchies of Europe were being shaken to their foundations. The French Revolution terrified Catherine. When, in 1793, the news of Louis XVI's execution by the mobs of Paris reached St. Petersburg, she was anguished and she was outraged.
The very name of France should be exterminated. Equality is a monster.
She turned away from her own enlightened instincts. She repudiated her old friends, the philosophes. She died in 1796.
To order a videocassette copy of the Hermitage, a Russian Odyssey, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to Video Finders, 4401 Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, 90027.
A presentation of South Carolina ETV. This program is made possible by a grant from the American Friends of the State Hermitage Museum, Incorporated. Additional funds were provided by the Robinson Foundation. For more information regarding the Hermitage Museum, please contact the American Friends of the State Hermitage Museum, Incorporated, 1400 North Woodward, Suite 165, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, 48304.
This is your statewide public television network, University of North Carolina Television. Learning for a lifetime.
Next on UNC TV, our exploration of Western art continues with another episode of The Hermitage, a Russian Odyssey. Then, at 11, go shopping at Grace Brothers, where the clerks are sure to ask, "Are you being served?" At 11:30, enjoy the fascinating late-night talk of North Carolina native Charlie Rose. And at 12:30, stay tuned for an encore presentation of North Carolina Now. It's right here only on UNC TV.
Imagine the excitement, the passion, the music. Now, imagine it live. Experience opening night of the North Carolina Symphony. See it live, Saturday, September 6th at 8 p.m., only on UNC TV.
Some celebrated the glory of a higher power. Others were slaves to the joys of the flesh. One person understands them like no one else.
Every now and then, art takes a completely unexpected twist.
Sister Wendy's story of painting.
Sunday night at 9 on UNC TV.
The American Experience presents FDR, one of the presidents.
was the man with the big, easy smile, the infectious sense of humor.
President, how soon are you coming back? Just as soon as Congress will let me.
He loved conversation, company, and good times.
Last year I nearly killed a photographer. All ready?
This was how Americans saw Franklin Roosevelt. This was the man they trusted so much, they elected him president 4 times.
People just idolized him. The most astounding thing was the pictures of Roosevelt you saw everywhere. Bus stations, libraries, barbershops, homes. There were pictures of Roosevelt. The entire country decided he was the savior.
We face the future with confidence and with courage. We are Americans.
FDR, one of the presidents on the American Experience.
Join acclaimed interviewer Charlie Rose as he engages America's most provocative and entertaining people in fascinating one-on-one interviews and roundtable discussions. For intriguing talk and fascinating conversation, look no further than Charlie Rose. Tonight at 11:30 only on UNC TV.
This box wastes as much as it produces. This box makes workers sick. And this box leaks money. Obviously, it's time to think outside the box. The solutions are out there. Want to see them? Join us in Planet Neighborhood. We've got big ideas for a small world.
Monday night at 8 on UNC TV.
It has been said that the life or death of a house on the coast depends on its connectors and maintaining its building envelope. Let me tell you about it.
Living on the Edge, a consumer guide to buying and owning coastal property.
Tuesday night at 10 on UNC TV.
From this old life-saving station, hardy locals used to rescue mariners in distress off the North Carolina coast. Now our coast faces other dangers, and we need a new kind of hero. I'm Jim Lutzy. Learn all about it on Treasure Coast.
Don't miss it. Coming Wednesday, September 10th, only on UNC TV. From cooking to crafts, woodworking to gardening, UNC TV brings North Carolinians the best in how-to programs. Learning for a lifetime on your statewide public television network, UNC TV.
You're watching WUNL-TV, Channel 26, Winston-Salem, one of the 11 stations of the UNC TV network.
This program is made possible by a grant from the American Friends of the State Hermitage Museum, Incorporated. Additional funds were provided by the Robinson Foundation. The Hermitage, Palace of the Russian Tsars, center of St. Petersburg's art and culture. It has withstood centuries of the wrenching violence of Russia's history. In 1700, Peter the Great built a new capital city, St. Petersburg, and opened Russia to the culture and commerce of Western Europe. When Catherine the Great came to power in 1762, she amassed an enormous body of European masterworks for the Winter Palace of the Tsars. Over time, the size and variety of its collections grew to rank among those of the world's great museums. From Rembrandts to Picassos, from Van Dycks to Matisses, from historic icons of the Russian Orthodox Church to artifacts of the Tsars. This monument to culture means more to the Russian people than just a collection of art. It is an embodiment of their heritage, a link to their very own past. It is a repository of pride and accomplishment. It is their Hermitage.
By the end of the 18th century, the Hermitage was regarded as one of the most important museums in Europe, though most of the public, most of the time, had no access to its 2,658 pictures. In her collection, Catherine had more French art than any other. When she bought paintings such as Chardin's Attributes of the Arts, she hoped to bring the spirit of the 18th century Enlightenment into Russia. Catherine was profoundly influenced by French philosophers such as Voltaire in conceiving of a new Russian state. She spoke and wrote French as her first language. The French playwright, novelist, and encyclopedist Denis Diderot spent a winter in St. Petersburg talking to Catherine about the intellectual components of the good society. Just as the mythic sculptor Pygmalion created a statue of Galatea which came to life, so France brought the inspiration of the Enlightenment to the ruling intellect of Russia. The rendering of the Pygmalion legend by François Boucher was one of the jewels of Catherine's collection. Most particularly, Catherine relied on French art and French philosophy to modernize her court and her country. After her death, the whirlwind of revolution carried Napoleon into power and created a new order in France. Exchanges of pleasantry between the French and the Russians were about to end. Catherine had been succeeded by her son, Tsar Paul I. Like his father, Paul was neurotic and capricious. Paul detested his mother, Catherine the Great. The feeling was mutual. Paul was so delighted at Catherine's death that he decorated the messenger who brought him the news. He hated Catherine's winter palace. The new Tsar took 700 paintings out of it, added a few distinguished purchases of his own, and took up residence elsewhere. A Russian artist of the day produced a rather unflattering caricature of Paul. For this one drawing, the artist was banished to Siberia for the rest of his life. Clearly, Paul I was unbalanced. In 1801, a group of noblemen decided to depose him. His son, who would succeed Paul as Tsar Alexander I, was assured that his father's life would be spared. Alexander had already said, "If and when my own turn comes, I shall have to dedicate myself to my country and never let it become again a toy in a madman's hands." But the plotters didn't keep their promise. The mad Tsar Paul was strangled in the process of removing him. Alexander I ascended the Russian imperial throne with a burden of guilt heavier than the crown which symbolized his autocracy. Alexander was an interesting combination of character traits. He was deeply religious, charming, devious, and dutiful. He increased Russia's military power, enacted liberal reforms, and became one of the more adroit diplomats in Europe. He needed all the diplomatic and military skill he could muster. This Hermitage Gallery of Heroes was built to commemorate the most traumatic and glorious event in 19th century Russian history, the War of 1812. The hall is dominated at the far end by an equestrian portrait of Alexander I. Here, he is enshrined as his country's hero and savior. He won the gratitude and adulation of Western Europe for turning back what had seemed to be an unopposable tide of conquest. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia. That great clash at arms, known in this country's history as the War of the Fatherland, was underway. An immense painting of the Battle of Borodino hangs in this same Hermitage gallery. Borodino was fought on September 7th, 1812. It was the first great artillery battle of modern history. It was also a fearful carnage. 70,000 French and Russian troops were slaughtered. When it was over, Napoleon said, "The French showed themselves worthy of victory, and the Russians of being invincible." The Russian commanders began a long tactical retreat, luring Napoleon toward Moscow. When the French got there, they found the great heartland city of Russia almost deserted and in flames. The Russians were willing to destroy Moscow rather than let it fall into the hands of foreign invaders. Too late, Bonaparte realized that in capturing Moscow, he had captured nothing. The oppressed Russian people stood by their Tsar. Food was getting scarce. Winter was coming on. On the other side of the Hermitage Gallery, another painting records the devastating French retreat. Russian armies and bands of Cossacks, including Mongols, pursued them, harassing and butchering. More than 90% of Napoleon's troops died in one of the most humiliating military defeats in history. The Russians followed Napoleon's army into France and deposed him. Alexander I entered Paris in triumph. Many Russian officers lingered in France for several years, indulging themselves in the pleasures of Paris while simultaneously absorbing the liberal political ideas of Western Europe. All of Paris was charmed by the handsome Tsar. Alexander became a friend of Napoleon Bonaparte's first wife, the Empress Josephine. Her portrait by François Pascal Gérard hangs in the Hermitage. Josephine and Alexander discovered a common interest in art. They spent many hours discussing her great collection of paintings, which Napoleon had looted from Germany. Josephine owned the Gonzaga cameo, one of the largest in the world. It dates to the 3rd century BC and shows the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy II and his wife. Napoleon gave it to Josephine, and she in turn presented it to Alexander I. Bernardino Luini's St. Catherine was among the 118 paintings in Josephine's collection. When she died, shortly after Alexander left Paris, he bought her pictures as a kindness to her impoverished family. They included Giovanni Biliverte's The Angel Departing from Tobias. Alexander also expanded the Hermitage's collection of Spanish art. The Girlhood of the Virgin by Francisco de Zubarán was among 15 Spanish masterpieces bought by the Tsar. Alexander also acquired one of Caravaggio's finest pictures, The Lute Player. It was painted in 1596 when Caravaggio was only 19 years old. It was the painter's favorite of his own work. Later, one of the most vivid and idealized portraits of Napoleon Bonaparte by Antoine Jean Gros came to the Hermitage. Napoleon's end began in Russia, but Russia caught a virus as a result of the French invasion. Many of Tsar Alexander's officers returned home infected by Western political ideals, government by consent instead of autocracy, the rights of man, which in Russian terms translated into demands for the emancipation of the serfs. Many of the officers who had returned from France formed secret societies. They talked incessantly about reforming Russia, but took little action for years. 19th century Russian history was dominated by a conflict between reformers and the entrenched power of the monarchy. The reformers wanted an end to serfdom, and they wanted to establish a constitutional government. St. Petersburg, home of the Hermitage, was not only the political capital of Russia in the early 19th century, it had become the literary and artistic headquarters as well. But Russian society as a whole was mired in serfdom and class rigidity. Western Europe, on the other hand, had seized upon the Enlightenment ideals of equality and the innate rights of man. There was a heady spirit of challenge in the Western air. Beethoven produced his great libertarian opera Fidelio. Schiller wrote the epic anti-tyranny poem Wilhelm Tell. In 1814, Francis Scott Key set down the lyrics of what was to become the American national anthem. Simon Bolivar established an independent Venezuela in 1817. And 6 years later, the United States proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine, which warned the old monarchies of Europe not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. In Russia, however, the emancipation of the serfs was decades away. The institution of Tsardom was about to take an autocratic turn for the worse. In November 1825, Alexander I died, or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. A persistent legend says he didn't die at all, but put aside his robes of state and became a religious hermit. When the Soviet authorities opened his tomb in 1926, it was empty. Alexander's next youngest brother, Prince Constantine, refused the throne. The succession then produced a third brother, Nicholas I. He was an army engineer by profession, a reactionary by inclination, and an autocrat in political practice. He announced, "I cannot permit that any individual should dare defy my wishes. The slightest infringement will be punished with all the force of the law. No pardon will be granted." The army officers who'd been talking about political reform for years were suddenly galvanized into action. On December 26th, a group of officers assembled 3,000 soldiers in a square near the Winter Palace. Their demands were modest: a constitutional monarchy and an end to serfdom. To the new Tsar, that was wild-eyed radicalism. After a day-long standoff, someone fired a shot and the tension erupted. The forces of the reformers were routed. And the revolt was over. The Decembrists, as history calls them, were men of noble aims, but they were hopelessly inept as plotters against the entrenched power of the Tsar. Imperial Russia's first attempt to reform itself had ended in blood and disappointment. The ringleaders were tried in the Winter Palace and found guilty. 5 of the Decembrist officers were hanged in the fortress of Peter and Paul, directly across the river from the imperial residence. And more than 100 others were exiled to Siberia, including Nikolai Bestushev, an artist and writer, as well as a naval officer, who documented the lives and deprivations of the Decembrists in exile. His self-portrait hangs in the Hermitage. Tsar Nicholas regarded himself as a victim of the whole affair. He wrote a long and petulant letter to his mother. "My dear and good Mama, I feel extreme anguish, at the same time gratitude to God, who has allowed me to bring this horrible case to an end. Only the idea of a terrible duty enables me to endure such martyrdom." Nicholas I's autocratic, stubborn instincts hardened during his 30 years of rule. Britain's young Queen Victoria was struck by the Tsar's unbending nature and wrote of his state visit to England. "He is stern and severe, with fixed principles of duty which nothing on earth will make him change. He is sincere, I'm certain, even in his most despotic acts, from a sense that it's the only way to govern." For all that, Nicholas did more for the Hermitage than any Russian ruler since Catherine the Great. He lavished money and attention on the museum. And he admitted select echelons of the public for the first time. Those who got in had to apply far in advance and wear evening clothes on the day of their visit. Faces from the past stared down at them, from the masterworks of Titian, 16th century Dutch musketeers of 1532, painted by Dirk Jacobs, and from 1495, St. Bavo by Geertken Toets and Jans. (1825). 61 years have passed since Catherine the Great bought her first collection of pictures. Rebellions, one violent and massive, one brief and well-intentioned, have troubled the Russian air. The Hermitage has outlived the intention of its founder and builders. It is not a statement of Russia's place in the European scheme of things. It's a monument to its own contents, the creative genius of centuries and nations. It's taken on a life of its own, which will continue undisturbed by the passage of mere history which lies ahead. Nicholas I's obsession with order expressed itself in the pleasure he took in military precision. He loved to personally drill his troops. Nicholas expected the same order and precision in the operation of the Hermitage. Someone who worked at the museum wrote a description of the Tsar as self-appointed curator. He imagined himself to be a special expert in everything, who never doubted himself in anything, a person of narrow thoughts and tastes. Writers, as well as artists in the mid-19th century, found much to inspire them once the public was admitted to the Hermitage. The poet Alexander Pushkin, who both charmed and quarreled with Nicholas I, read deeply in the library of Voltaire, which Catherine the Great had bought when the philosopher died. Pushkin's notebooks were filled with Voltaire's somewhat acerbic epigrams and theories about the virtues of civil liberty and social equality. Nicholas obviously did not share Pushkin's admiration. The sight of Houdon's statue of the seated Voltaire enraged him. "Destroy this old monkey," he roared. The museum staff quickly removed the marble portrait of Voltaire to a place where the Tsar couldn't see it. (1837), disaster. A catastrophic fire destroyed the 1,000 rooms of the Winter Palace. The enormous structure took 2 days to burn. At the far end of the Winter Palace, the bulk of the Hermitage galleries and their contents were saved, thanks to heroic efforts by firemen, soldiers, and the museum staff. Tsar Nicholas ordered the palace rebuilt and ready for imperial occupancy within a year. The deadline was almost met. Within 15 months, the palace was restored and made even grander than before. Catherine the Great had believed that visual splendor was a demonstration of political and imperial power. In his own way, Nicholas agreed with her, or at least decided to emulate her. He had plans drawn up for an addition to the Hermitage, his addition, erected to the greater glory of Nicholas I. It was designed by the German architect Leo von Klenze, who had built celebrated museums in Munich. As well as extolling himself and his reign, Nicholas intended his addition to the Hermitage to be the finest showcase for art in Europe. This room, and others similar to it, built by Nicholas I, are unlike anything we've seen up to now. This is not an opulent pleasure dome. The new Hermitage was built expressly as a museum, an art gallery. Its sole purpose is to show pictures. And in its construction and design, Nicholas spared no expense. The galleries of Nicholas's new addition were designed to accommodate pictures already in the Hermitage collection, some of them enormous. The great rooms held paintings like Canaletto's reception of the French ambassador in Venice, and Luca Giordano's Mourning. Depicting the burial of Jesus. The statuary was also placed with exacting care. This collection of Roman sculpture is on display in a room created especially for it. an environment tailored to the works of art it contains. Architect von Klenze gave prominence to the white sculpture by using contrasting walls of red and green marble. The finest sculpture from all the royal palaces was assembled here in one grand collection, which included a first-century Roman version of the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. It's also known as the Tauride Venus and was given to Peter the Great by Pope Clement XI. Nicholas I was a mixed blessing for the Hermitage. He meddled in every aspect of the great collections, even redesigning the guards' uniforms. This deplorable czar imposed his own taste, getting rid of pictures he didn't like. The most prominent targets of Nicholas's displeasure were the works of Rembrandt. Dutch art reached one of its sublime heights in the work of Rembrandt van Rijn. He was born in 1606 and died in 1669. He was a master draftsman, colorist, and craftsman of light, as in his breathtaking Descent from the Cross. Few of his contemporaries could match Rembrandt's power as a storyteller. His themes were mainly biblical, as in his Parable of the Laborers in the Vineyard. But to make his characters more real, Rembrandt placed them in settings familiar to 17th century Holland. The Holy Family is decidedly Dutch. Joseph works at his carpentry, while Mary rocks the baby Jesus in an ordinary wicker cradle. The Return of the Prodigal Son was painted as Rembrandt was going blind, yet he was able to convey a powerful interplay of characters and ideas. He placed the son who had stayed home to one side, watching in dismay, while the prodigal son, returning in shame, still receives his father's love and blessing. Rembrandt was not a portrait painter, a renderer of likenesses for the mighty. Rather, he was a portrayer of the human condition in all of its seasons. When Nicholas I came to power, the Hermitage owned 54 paintings by Rembrandt, more than any other museum in the world. But the Tsar, in a characteristic fit of poor judgment, ordered a majority of them sold, leaving the Hermitage with 25 Rembrandt paintings, still more than any other museum in the world. In this drastic pruning and purging carried out by Nicholas I, 1,219 works were banished, slightly more than a quarter of the entire collection of paintings. The Hermitage curators and staff watched in helpless despair as the blundering Tsar got rid of masterpieces at a fraction of their value. The Curing of Bartimaeus by Lucas van Leyden, a favorite of Catherine the Great, was sold for a mere 30 rubles in 1854. In 1885, the museum had to pay 8,000 rubles to get it back. Nicholas's repressive hand touched every part of Russia's intellectual, creative, and political life. There was absolute press censorship, and no opposition was tolerated. The Tsar's police became a ubiquitous presence in Russia. Its notorious Third Section spied on intellectuals, teachers, anyone who might commit the sin of independent thinking. People who disagreed with the Tsar were frequently declared insane and locked up. Nicholas I died in 1855. He's a bit of a contradiction. He did build this beautiful new Hermitage, but his order-obsessed mind and ossified rule planted the grapes of Russian wrath. The history that came after him was violent. Nicholas was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. His coronation was a time of rejoicing, as much perhaps over the ending of an old czar's dismal rule as the coming of a new ruler about whom little was known. Alexander II turned out to be the exact opposite of his father, an open, liberal-minded reformer. He was the most progressive ruler in the history of Imperial Russia. He had to rule within severe limitations imposed upon him by law, Russian inertia, and history. But he improved whatever was susceptible to improvement, including the administration of the Hermitage. Alexander appointed an historian named Gidyonev as director of the museum, and he made two important purchases, even though the rate of acquisition for the Hermitage was slowing. One of them was Leonardo da Vinci's Lita Madonna. Da Vinci completed it in 1491. It epitomizes the essence of the Renaissance, a marriage of the spiritual and the physical. The other acquisition, Raphael's Conestabile Madonna, was painted in 1502 when the artist was 19, and it's still in Raphael's original frame. The new museum director, Stepan Gidyonev, set up an archaeological commission. Excavations in southern Russia paid off in Scythian gold. Magnificent ornaments of a pre-Russian tribe. The Scythians were a fierce, nomadic people who, 8 centuries before the birth of Christ, controlled vast areas of what is now southern Russia. This ornament, made in the 6th century BC, was probably part of a regal headpiece. The Scythians are known to us by the gold ornamentation they loved and by their battles against many enemies. They faded from history around 300 BC when the Celts drove them out of the Balkans. The archaeological excavations in southern Russia, begun under Tsar Alexander II, produced a flow of Scythian artifacts for the Hermitage that continued into the 20th century. The changes that Alexander brought to the museum, intelligent, constructive, and sensible, were small echoes of the improvements the new Tsar tried to bring to the country as a whole. He wanted to persuade the aristocracy that the institution of serfdom, under which 20 million peasants were the property of landowners and the government, was a ticking bomb. He said the existing order of serfdom cannot remain unchanged. It's better to abolish bondage from above than to wait for the time when it will abolish itself from below. In 1861, Alexander formally emancipated the serfs, a year before slavery was abolished in the United States by Abraham Lincoln. Alexander's Emancipation Proclamation was read in every town square and in manor house courtyards across Russia. Rejoicing serfs kissed the ground they had worked for centuries and which now belonged to them. The rejoicing didn't last long. While they were technically free, Agricultural serfs had to pay their former masters for the land they'd been granted, but most of them had neither money nor any means of earning it. The optimism with which Alexander's reign had begun began to fade. A new generation of Russian radicals took up the serfs' cause. Many went to prison or exile. In 1878, the composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky gave voice to the despair of the middle class. We're living through terrible times. On the one side, a completely panic-stricken government. On the other side, ill-fated youth. Thousands of them exiled without trial to lands where not even a crow flies. And between these two extremes, the masses, watching everything without a sign of protest. One group of terrorists, most of them from middle-class families, dedicated themselves to assassinating public officials. Others went into the countryside preaching rural revolution. The doctrines were abstract. The serfs seemed more bewildered than aroused to action. In St. Petersburg, a group of young men and women calling themselves People's Will began to plot the murders of high-ranking officials. Alexander II, the reformer Tsar, was at the top of their list. On February 13, 1881, a terrorist threw a bomb at the Tsar's carriage. Alexander was returning from a meeting with a committee he'd appointed to write a new constitution. After the explosion, he got out to see what had happened. A second bomb was fatal. This church was built as a memorial to the martyred Tsar on the exact spot where he was murdered. The assassination set off a series of catastrophic circumstances. It turned the educated elite of Russia against its own radical children. It brought about the ascension of Tsar Alexander III, a man so traumatized by his father's murder that he reverted to the arch-conservatism of Nicholas I. Alexander III inherited a pathological fear of revolution. He hunted down radicals, and he began the policy that made him one of the most hated men of his time, Russification. 41% of his people were non-Russians. They were as Slavic as Georgians, as Asian as Mongols and Uzbekis. They were subjects of the Tsar, but spoke their own languages and worshipped God in multiple faiths. Under Alexander III's Russification decrees, only Russian could be spoken in schools and local government offices. The only permissible faith was the Russian Orthodox faith. There was only one acceptable nationalism: Russian. Instead of uniting the vast empire of Alexander III, his Russification decrees divided and enraged it. The assassination of the Tsar's father, Alexander II, was blamed on, among other groups, Russia's 5 million Jews. Since Catherine the Great's reign, the world's largest population of Jews was restricted to an area of Russia called the Pale of Settlement. It included large parts of Russian Poland, and it bordered on Germany and Austria. An anti-Semitic propaganda barrage began after the assassination charges against Russian Jewry. Thousands of Jews were killed by mobs. The police stood by and watched. 1 million Jews fled Alexander III's Russia. Most headed for America. The Hermitage did not escape the Tsar's chauvinism. Alexander decided there wasn't enough Russian painting in the collection. So he created his own Russian gallery within the Hermitage for works such as Fortune-Telling by Alexei Venetzianov. And this self-portrait by Karl Ivanovich Brulov. Like many other Russian painters, he had studied the masterworks that hung in the Hermitage. A life-size portrait of Count Leo Tolstoy was the work of Ilya Repin, the foremost realist painter of the time. Repin's Tolstoy remained in the Hermitage for decades. It's now in the Russian State Museum. Aside from his preoccupation with Russian art, Alexander III didn't interfere with the work of the Hermitage's director, Alexander Vassilchikov. He persuaded the Tsar to give the museum pictures from other imperial palaces. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo's Maecenas presenting the arts to Augustus came from the Gatchina Palace, where it had hung for more than a century. Rembrandt's David's Farewell to Jonathan had been bought by Peter the Great. It was sent to the Hermitage from his palace at Peterhof. And Houdin's statue of Voltaire was restored to public view. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the Hermitage collection had grown in numbers and splendor to a degree that would have astonished its founder, Catherine the Great. It was now regarded as one of the world's greatest collections. It was a magnificent panorama of art dating from medieval times. Its collections had been constantly enriched by acquisition of works by great masters. It included magnificent collections of religious objects, Christian artifacts from 13th century France, and priceless icons of the Russian Orthodox Church. Greek and Roman stone sculpture crowded its halls and galleries. Among the personal possessions of the Tsars, many objects of magnificent craftsmanship would ultimately become part of the museum's permanent exhibits. The Egyptian collection, begun in 1852, contains some of the most dramatic art of the ancient pharaohs. As the century closed, the last Tsar still lived next door to the Hermitage in the Winter Palace. A painting in his apartments looks across the Neva River to the fortress of Peter and Paul. Originally a proclamation of Russia's defiance of Sweden, the fortress was the centerpiece of old St. Petersburg. Then, in the reign of Alexander III, Peter and Paul became an ominous place, a symbol of the state's savagery. The prisons, like this one in the dreaded fortress of Peter and Paul, were overflowing. Hundreds of real or suspected socialists, anarchists, or land and freedom activists were being held here, awaiting transportation to Siberia or execution. Maxim Gorky, the writer, propagandist, and revolutionary. Prince Peter Kropotkin, who donated his family fortune to the revolutionary cause. Then, in 1887, a young man named Alexander Ulyanov was arrested for complicity in a plot to murder the Tsar. He was convicted and sentenced to be hanged. He spent the last night of his life in this cell. His sentence would have been commuted to prison or exile had he been willing to inform on his fellow conspirators. But he refused and was executed. Alexander Ulyanov had a younger brother named Vladimir. Radicalized by Alexander's death, he changed his name to Lenin and became the father of the Russian Revolution. As Russia was tormenting itself with its history, the Hermitage stood serene on the banks of the Neva. History is transitory. Art is alive but immobile. History is obsessed with each moment it passes through. Art fixes its gaze upon eternity. The death knell of the Tsars was sounding. The art of the Hermitage, like Russia itself, was about to pass from imperial to revolutionary hands.
To order a videocassette copy of The Hermitage, a Russian Odyssey, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to Video Finders, 4401 Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, 90027.
A presentation of South Carolina ETV. This program is made possible by a grant from the American Friends of the State Hermitage Museum, Incorporated. Additional funds were provided by the Robinson Foundation. For more information regarding the Hermitage Museum, please contact the American Friends of the State Hermitage Museum, Incorporated, 1400 North Woodward, Suite 165, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, 48304.